Welcome to Lesson 7 and My Size Unit 24, What's Consistent About Matter. In this lesson, students will answer the question, how can we use physical and chemical changes to identify unknown substances? Students will figure out that there's some properties of matter, like the ability to rust, flammability, and reactivity, that they can only observe when matter undergoes a chemical change. In the engage portion of this lesson, you're going to introduce students to the problem that they're trying to solve during this lesson. Set up the scenario that you're going to bake a batch of cookies for an upcoming school event. As you're going through this cabinet, you're able to find all of the ingredients except for the sugar, cornstarch, and baking soda. That being said, you have these 3 containers of unlabeled powders that you think are sugar, cornstarch, and baking soda, but you can't tell them apart. You're going to ask the students, what do they think that we can do to figure out which substance is which? You'll transition to the explore part of this lesson, where you'll actually have kids conduct an experiment to figure out which substance is which based on chemical properties. Each group is going to need the following materials. They'll need a tray, the spot plate, 3 pipettes, toothpicks, a cup of vinegar, and a cup of water. As a material note, you'll be able to throw away these spot plates at the end of the investigation. Start off by labeling the wells, row A, row B, and row C. Then in each row, label the individual wells 1, 2, 3, and 4. In this image here, all of row A is filled with cornstarch, so we made 3 wells of cornstarch. Then in row B, we put 3 wells of baking soda, and row C, we put 3 wells of sugar. Students will also need identifying unknown substances found in their student journal. Before students start mixing anything, have them fill out the first 2 columns in the data table. Have them observe the color of the powders and the texture of the powders and see if they can recognize any similarities and differences between these powders. The first thing students are going to do is fill every well labeled number 1 with water. They're going to use the toothpick to stir, and they should see if the substance reacts with the water. They'll record their observations in the soluble in water column found on the data table, and then they'll repeat that step, except they'll use vinegar the next time. In the last step of this investigation, you should circulate the room and add iodine to all students' wells labeled 3. They should then record in their student journal whether or not they believe a chemical change occurred. Throughout this investigation, students should keep in mind the evidence of chemical changes. If you look at this picture here, you'll see that in well 2 in row B, we see some bubbles forming. Bubbles are evidence of a chemical change. In well 3 of row A, you'll see that the iodine turned black. That's color change, another evidence of a chemical change. In the explain part of this lesson, students will need properties of kitchen powders found in their student journal. They're going to use the data table at the top of this page and compare it with their investigation results they got on the previous student journal page. They should come to the conclusion that substance A was baking soda, substance B was cornstarch, and substance C was sugar. At the end of the explain, students will read a passage that explains that they cannot measure chemical properties unless a chemical reaction occurs. In the elaborate portion of this lesson, students will have a scenario in which they will have to use both physical and chemical properties to identify unknown substances. In the evaluate portion of this lesson, students will revisit the initial prompt about the unlabeled substances found in the cupboard. Students will need to describe how they can use physical and chemical properties to identify these unlabeled containers. By the end of this lesson, students will have made observations about physical and chemical properties of matter to help identify unknown powders.